Nobody questioned why Sarah Mitchell was in the cockpit of the B-52. The passenger manifest listed her as civilian contractor, which could mean anything from technical support to government oversight. She looked harmless enough, a woman in her late 40s wearing a simple blazer and slacks, carrying a worn leather briefcase. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had tried making conversation during pre-flight. "First time on a buff, ma'am?" he'd asked, using the Air Force nickname for the B-52. She'd just smiled politely and shook her head. No explanation, no small talk. Captain Dave Williams, the aircraft commander, had been equally curious but professionally disinterested. His mission briefing said to expect one civilian observer, credentials approved at wing level. The woman had the right paperwork, so he didn't push. The B-52H Stratofortress was a flying museum, but still one of the most powerful aircraft in the U.S. inventory. This particular bird had been rolling down runways since 1962. Today's mission was routine, a training flight from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana to Colorado Springs. "Ma'am, you comfortable back there?" asked Technical Sergeant Mike Chen, the flight engineer. Sarah Mitchell looked up from what appeared to be a technical manual. "I'm fine, thank you." Something about her voice struck Chen as familiar, but he couldn't place it. Military, definitely. Probably former Air Force, given how comfortable she seemed surrounded by switches and gauges. "Barksdale Tower, Eagle 447 ready for departure," Williams called over the radio. "Eagle 447, cleared for takeoff runway 15. The B-52 thundered down the runway, its 8 engines creating enough noise to wake half of Louisiana. Mitchell didn't flinch as the aircraft lifted off, didn't grab the armrests like most first-time passengers. She just sat there, calm as Sunday morning. 20 minutes into the flight, cruising at 35,000 feet, everything was routine. Williams was discussing training objectives with Lieutenant Colonel Parker, the co-pilot. Chen was monitoring engine parameters. Rodriguez was updating navigation logs. That's when Captain Williams suddenly grabbed his chest and slumped forward over the controls. "Dave!" Lieutenant Colonel Parker shouted as Williams collapsed against the control yoke. The B-52 immediately pitched forward into a steep dive, alarms screaming throughout the cockpit. "I've got the aircraft!" Parker called out, grabbing his controls and pulling back hard. But Williams' deadweight was still pressed against the primary flight controls, fighting every input Parker tried to make. Technical Sergeant Chen unbuckled immediately. "Sir, we need to get Captain Williams off the controls." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was already calling Mayday. "Barksdale approach, Eagle 447 declaring emergency, pilot incapacitation, requesting priority handling." The aircraft was in a 30-degree nose-down attitude, losing altitude fast. At this rate, they had maybe 3 minutes before hitting the ground. Parker was strong, but trying to overpower both Williams' unconscious weight and the aircraft's natural tendency was like arm wrestling a freight train. That's when Sarah Mitchell unbuckled her harness and stood up. "Excuse me," she said calmly, moving toward the pilot's seat with surprising confidence. "Ma'am, please stay seated," Chen called out. "We're in an emergency." But Mitchell ignored him. She reached Williams' seat and, with surprising strength, pulled the unconscious pilot back away from the controls. "Colonel Parker, I've got him. Take the aircraft." Parker didn't have time to question how a civilian contractor knew his rank. He focused on pulling the B-52 out of its dive. The altimeter was spinning down through 25,000 feet. Come on," Parker muttered, pulling back with everything he had. The massive bomber slowly began to respond. Mitchell had maneuvered Williams away from the controls and was checking his pulse. "He's unconscious, but breathing. Pulse is rapid and thready. Looks like a cardiac event." Chen stared at her. "Ma'am, are you a medic?" "Among other things," she replied. "Do you have a medical kit on board?" "Yes, ma'am, but—" "Get it. Check if there's an AED." She looked at Parker, who was still fighting to stabilize the aircraft. "Colonel, what's your fuel state?" Parker was too busy flying to wonder why a civilian was asking technical questions. "About 6 hours remaining, but the aircraft is handling like a pig." "That's because you're fighting a hydraulic leak," Mitchell said matter-of-factly. "Check your primary flight control pressure." Chen, pulling the medical kit, stopped dead. "How did you—" Mitchell was already moving toward the flight engineer's panel. Your number 2 hydraulic system is showing amber. The pressure drop started when Captain Williams collapsed and hit the hydraulic isolation switch. She pointed to a switch in the wrong position. Chen looked at the gauges and his jaw dropped. She was absolutely right. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said slowly, "who exactly are you?" Sarah Mitchell looked around the cockpit at 8 young airmen staring at her with confusion and dawning respect. "Someone who used to do this for a living." "Used to do what for a living?" Chen asked, though he was already starting to suspect the answer. Sarah Mitchell flipped the hydraulic isolation switch back to its proper position, and immediately the flight controls became more responsive. "Fly B-52s," she said simply. The cockpit went dead silent, except for the constant hum of 8 jet engines. "You're a pilot?" Parker asked, finally getting the aircraft under control. "Was a pilot. Retired Air Force. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, formerly of the 93rd Bomb Squadron. She was checking Captain Williams' pulse while talking. Flew buffs for 12 years before moving to test pilot school." Rodriguez nearly dropped his radio. "Test pilot school? Ma'am, that's the top 1% of Air Force pilots." "More like top half of 1%, Mitchell corrected. "But who's counting?" She looked up at Parker. "Colonel, we need to get this aircraft on the ground. Captain Williams needs medical attention, and I'm seeing other problems developing." Parker was struggling to process what he'd learned. The quiet civilian contractor was apparently a former Air Force test pilot with more experience than his entire crew combined. "What kind of problems?" he asked. Mitchell was scanning the instrument panel with practiced eyes. "Your number 3 engine is running hot. Oil pressure on number 5 is dropping, and you've got an electrical issue developing in the aft equipment bay." Chen looked at his gauges and confirmed every item she'd mentioned. "Holy shit. Sorry, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. You're absolutely right. How are you seeing all this?" "Because I helped write the emergency procedures manual for this aircraft," Mitchell said. "Back in 1995, I was part of the team that developed updated flight operations procedures after the hydraulic redesign." Lieutenant Colonel Parker was starting to understand. "Ma'am, are you here in some kind of oversight capacity?" "Not exactly." Mitchell had pulled the medical kit over to Williams. "I was supposed to be observing your crew's performance on a routine training mission. Command wanted an independent assessment of your unit's readiness." Rodriguez laughed nervously. "Well, I guess we're about to get tested for real." "That you are, Sergeant." Mitchell looked around the cockpit. "And so far, you're doing exactly what you should be doing. But we need to make decisions quickly. Colonel Parker, what's the nearest suitable airfield?" Parker consulted his navigation display. "Looks like Altus Air Force Base in Oklahoma is about 40 minutes southwest. Long runway and full emergency services." "Good choice. Chen, start shutting down number 3 engine before it overheats. Rodriguez, get on the radio and declare a full emergency." The crew moved with practiced efficiency, following her instructions without question. There was something about her calm authority that inspired confidence. "Ma'am," Parker said as he banked toward Oklahoma, "if you're a retired test pilot, why are you listed as a civilian contractor?" Mitchell smiled grimly. "Because officially I've been retired for 15 years. Unofficially, the Air Force occasionally asks me to take a look at things." "And what's your opinion of our situation?" "That you're about to find out what it's really like to be an Air Force pilot." "Colonel Parker," Mitchell said as she finished checking Williams' vitals, "I need you to be honest with me. How many hours do you have in the B-52? Parker hesitated. "About 200 hours, ma'am. I'm still fairly new to the aircraft." Mitchell nodded. She'd suspected as much from watching him handle the emergency. He was competent, but lacked the instinctive feel that came with thousands of hours. "And emergency landings? In the simulator? Maybe a dozen. For real?" Parker's voice got quieter. "This would be my first." "Chen, what about you?" "About 300 hours as flight engineer, ma'am. Nothing like this." Mitchell looked around at the young crew. They were good airmen, well-trained and professional, but this was exactly the situation that separated textbook knowledge from real-world experience. "All right, here's what we're going to do," she said. "Colonel Parker, you're still the aircraft commander. This is your crew, your mission, your responsibility. But I'm going to talk you through this step by step." "Ma'am, I appreciate the help, but..." Colonel, Mitchell interrupted gently but firmly. In 30 minutes, you're going to be attempting to land 185,000 pounds of aircraft with partial hydraulics, one engine shut down, and an electrical system that's failing progressively. I've done that landing 3 times. The cockpit went quiet. Twice during test flights, once in combat. Combat meant this woman had flown missions in Iraq or Afghanistan, probably both. Rodriguez, get me a complete weather report for Altus. Chen, configure the aircraft for single-point failure landing. Parker, maintain current heading until we get closer. Rodriguez was already on the radio. Altus approach, Eagle 447, requesting current weather and emergency services status. Eagle 447, Altus approach. Wind 240 at 12 gusting to 18, visibility 10 miles, ceiling 3,000, broken. Emergency services are rolling to runway 13 right. Mitchell took the radio. Altus approach, Eagle 447. Be advised we have a former Air Force test pilot on board assisting with the emergency. We anticipate a normal approach, but request crash and rescue to be prepared. Eagle 447, Roger. Understand you have qualified assistance on board. Parker looked back at Mitchell with relief and apprehension. Ma'am, what if something goes wrong? Something already went wrong, Colonel. Now we're going to fix it. She moved closer to the pilot's seat. The best way to learn to be a pilot. Parker nodded, though his hands were shaking slightly. Yes, ma'am. Good. Now let's bring this bird home. 20 minutes later, the B-52 was beginning its descent toward Altus Air Force Base when the situation got worse. Ma'am, Chen called out, his voice tight with concern. I'm showing electrical fluctuations in the primary bus, and oil pressure on number 5 engine is dropping fast. Mitchell moved to look over Chen's shoulder at the engine instruments. How fast? Went from normal to amber in the last 2 minutes. Temperature's starting to climb too. Shut it down, Mitchell said without hesitation. Ma'am, we're still 20 minutes out. Chen, shut down number 5 now, or we're going to have an engine fire. Trust me. Chen's hands flew over the engine controls, securing the failing engine. Now they were approaching with 2 engines shut down on the same side of the aircraft. Eagle 447, Altus approach. We're showing possible engine problems on your aircraft. Say status. Altus approach, Eagle 447. We've shut down engine number 5 as a precaution. Still continuing approach with 6 engines operating normally. Parker's voice was getting tighter. Ma'am, with 2 engines down on the left side. Colonel, this aircraft was designed to fly on 6 engines. You've got 6 good engines running. The approach is going to feel different, but you can handle it. That's when the electrical system failed completely. The cockpit lights flickered and went out, leaving them flying on emergency power. Half the instrument panel went dark, and the radio crackled with static. What the hell? Parker started. Primary electrical failure, Mitchell said calmly. Chen, switch to emergency power and backup instruments. Rodriguez, try to contact Altus on the emergency frequency. Ma'am, Chen said, his voice strained. We've lost primary flight controls. I'm showing hydraulic pressure dropping on System 1. Mitchell looked at the instruments that were still working. This was rapidly becoming the kind of emergency that ended up in accident investigation reports. Colonel Parker, how are the controls feeling? Heavy, really heavy, like I'm fighting the aircraft for every input. That's the hydraulic assist failing. You're going to have to muscle it down manually. Mitchell moved to stand directly behind his seat. Chen, give me backup power to the essential instruments only. Rodriguez, transmit in the blind that we're experiencing multiple system failures. Ma'am, Parker said, sweat beading on his forehead. I'm not sure I can land this thing with manual controls. Yes, you can, Mitchell said firmly. Thousands of pilots landed aircraft manually before hydraulic assist was invented. The aircraft wants to fly. Your job is just to convince it to go where you want. But I've never... Colonel, look at me. Mitchell's voice cut through his panic. You've got this. I'm going to talk you through every step, but you're going to fly this airplane to the ground." "Copy." Parker took a deep breath and nodded. "Copy, ma'am." "Outstanding. Now let's show this old bird how it's done." 15 minutes later, the crippled B-52 was lined up for final approach to Altus Air Force Base. Through the cockpit windows, they could see emergency vehicles lined up along the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, and crash rescue equipment. Eagle 447, Altus Tower. Emergency services in position. Wind 250 at 15 gusting to 20. Runway 13, right cleared to land. Altus Tower. Eagle 447 cleared to land. Parker replied, his voice steady despite the sweat dripping down his face. "Remember, Colonel," Mitchell said calmly, "approach speed 165 knots. Don't fight the aircraft. Work with it. The runway is almost 3 miles long." Captain Williams was still unconscious but stable, secured in the back with Rodriguez monitoring his condition. 5 miles out, Parker called. "Gear coming down." The landing gear extended with mechanical thumps and hydraulic whines. With their electrical problems, there was always a chance the gear might not lock properly. "Gear down and locked," Chen reported, relief evident in his voice. "All green lights." 4 miles out, speed 170 knots. Mitchell watched the approach carefully. Without hydraulic assist, Parker was having to use considerable physical strength to control the aircraft, but he was managing to keep it stable. "You're doing great, Colonel, just like we practiced in the simulator." "Except this isn't the simulator," Parker grunted, wrestling with the controls. "No, it's not. It's better because this is real. And real pilots handle real emergencies." 3 miles out, speed 165 knots. The runway was clearly visible now. Altus had one of the longest runways in the Air Force, originally built for heavy bombers. Today, they were going to need every foot. 2 miles out, speed 160. "Perfect, Colonel. You're lined up beautifully. Let the aircraft settle naturally when you get into ground effect." That's when the remaining hydraulic system started showing problems. "Ma'am," Chen called out, "System 2 hydraulics are fluctuating, pressure's dropping." Mitchell glanced at the gauges. They were losing their last hydraulic system, which meant Parker was about to be flying a 185,000-pound aircraft with no power-assisted controls whatsoever. "Colonel, in about 30 seconds you're going to lose all hydraulic assist. The controls are going to get very heavy." "How heavy?" "Like trying to steer a freight train with a rope." "But you can do it. Thousands of pilots did it for decades before hydraulic assist existed." 1 mile out, speed 100 "I can barely move the stick," he said through gritted teeth. "You don't need big movements, Colonel. Small inputs, gentle pressure. Let the aircraft's natural stability work for you." The runway threshold was approaching fast. This was it, the moment that would determine whether they walked away from this emergency or became a statistic. Half mile. Speed 150. "Outstanding, Colonel. You've got this." Quarter mile out. Speed 145 knots, Parker called as the massive bomber descended toward the runway. Every muscle in his arms and shoulders was screaming from fighting the manual controls, but the aircraft was stable and lined up perfectly. "Beautiful approach, Colonel. Just let it settle." The B-52 crossed the runway threshold with plenty of clearance. For a moment they were floating in ground effect, the massive aircraft suspended between sky and earth by decades of aerodynamic engineering and one pilot's determination. "Don't force it down," Mitchell coached. "Let it come naturally." Parker held the aircraft steady, fighting every instinct to force it onto the runway. Without hydraulic assist, even small control inputs required enormous physical effort. His vision was blurring from exertion, but he kept the aircraft straight. The B-52 seemed to hang in the air forever, then finally settled onto the concrete with a gentle chirp of tires that would have made any instructor pilot proud. "Eagle 447, touchdown runway 13 right," Parker gasped into the radio. "Outstanding landing, Colonel," Mitchell said. Now deploy the drag chute and get us stopped." Parker pulled the drag chute handle and applied wheel brakes. The massive bomber began decelerating down the long runway, emergency vehicles following alongside. "Eagle 447, Altus Tower. Excellent job on that landing. Medical personnel are standing by." As the aircraft rolled to a stop, Mitchell could see ambulances already moving toward them. The immediate emergency was over, but Captain Williams still needed medical attention. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, as he unstrapped, "that was incredible. How did you stay so calm?" "Experience, Sergeant, and maybe a little luck. But ma'am," Chen said, "you knew exactly what to do at every step. You predicted system failures before they happened." Parker shut down the remaining engines and turned to face her. "Colonel Mitchell, who are you really?" Mitchell looked around the cockpit at the young airmen who'd just experienced the most intense hour of their flying careers. "I told you the truth, Colonel. I'm a retired Air Force test pilot. But what I didn't mention is that before test pilot school, I flew combat missions in B-52s. And after test pilot school, I spent 5 years as an instructor at the weapons school." The crew stared at her. The weapons school was legendary, the Air Force equivalent of Navy Top Gun. "Ma'am," Rodriguez asked quietly, "how many hours do you have in this aircraft?" "About 4,000 hours. Plus another 2,000 in the simulator, testing modifications and training other pilots." Parker's jaw dropped. "Man, that's more time than most pilots accumulate in their entire careers." "It is, which is why when command wants an honest assessment of a crew's capabilities, they sometimes ask me to take a ride." Mitchell stood as the emergency crews approached the aircraft. "Gentlemen, you just saved 8 lives and a $100 million aircraft. I'd say you passed the test." 3 hours later, Captain Williams was stable in the base hospital, with what doctors confirmed was a mild heart attack. The B-52 was parked on the Altus ramp, with maintenance crews swarming over it, finding exactly the problems Mitchell had predicted. The crew was in base operations, going through post-emergency debriefing with safety investigators. Mitchell sat quietly in the corner, answering questions when asked, but mostly letting the crew tell their story. "Colonel Parker," the investigating officer said, "walk me through your decision-making when Captain Williams became incapacitated." "Sir, my first priority was gaining control of the aircraft. Technical Sergeant Chen and I moved to get Captain Williams clear of the controls, while Staff Sergeant Rodriguez declared the emergency." "And the civilian contractor assisted?" Parker glanced at Mitchell. "Yes, sir. She knew exactly what to do. Move Captain Williams clear and immediately began providing medical assistance." "I see. Then what happened?" "She identified our hydraulic problem, sir. Spotted the switch that had been accidentally activated and corrected it. Without that, I'm not sure we could have maintained control." The investigating officer looked at Mitchell. "Ma'am, you have medical training?" "Basic combat medicine," Mitchell replied. "And aircraft systems knowledge?" "Some." Rodriguez couldn't contain himself. "Sir, she knew this aircraft better than we did. She spotted system failures, predicted mechanical problems, and talked us through the entire emergency." The investigating officer looked intrigued. "Ma'am, what exactly is your background?" Mitchell sighed. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, retired. I flew B-52s from 1988 to 2000, then went to test pilot school. After graduation, I was assigned to Edwards Air Force Base testing modifications to the B-52 fleet. After that, I was an instructor at the weapons school until I retired in 2010. The room went silent. The weapons school was legendary. "Ma'am," the investigating officer said carefully, "why were you on this particular flight?" "I was conducting an informal assessment of the 93rd Bomb Squadron's training program. Wing commander wanted an outside opinion on crew readiness." "And your assessment?" Mitchell looked around at Parker, Chen, Rodriguez, and the other crew members. These airmen performed exactly as trained when faced with a real emergency. They followed procedures, worked as a team, and made good decisions under pressure. "However," she continued, "this incident highlights some training gaps. Such as, these crew members had never seen multiple system failures in rapid succession. Real emergencies don't follow the textbook. They cascade and interact in unpredictable ways." Mitchell stood up. I recommend more complex scenario training. Make them deal with cascading failures, time pressure, and incomplete information. What about their performance today? Today, this crew exceeded every expectation. Colonel Parker's landing was textbook perfect despite losing all hydraulic assist. The entire crew functioned flawlessly under extreme pressure. The investigating officer closed his notebook. It sounds like this crew was fortunate to have you aboard. No, sir, Mitchell replied. I was fortunate to be flying with airmen that good. Later that evening, Mitchell found herself alone with Colonel Parker in the base officers club. The young pilot had insisted on buying her dinner, though he'd spent most of the meal asking technical questions. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Parker said over coffee. Shoot. Were you really just there to evaluate our training, or was there something else going on? Mitchell had been wondering when someone would ask that question. Parker was sharp. What makes you ask, Colonel? Well, ma'am, it seems like a big coincidence that one of the Air Force's most experienced B-52 pilots just happened to be on board when we had our worst possible emergency. Mitchell smiled. You think it wasn't a coincidence? I think the Air Force doesn't usually send weapons school instructors to evaluate routine training flights unless there's a specific reason. Parker was right. The real reason Mitchell had been on that flight was classified, but these airmen had earned the right to know part of the truth. You're correct that this wasn't a routine evaluation, Colonel. Your unit has been selected for a special assignment, and Command wanted to make sure your crews could handle high-stress situations. What kind of special assignment? The kind I can't discuss in an officers' club. But based on today's performance, I'm going to recommend your crew for the program. Parker set down his coffee cup. Are we talking about combat operations? I'm talking about the kind of mission where you might find yourself dealing with multiple system failures, enemy threats, and time-critical objectives all at the same time. Parker was quiet. And you think we're ready? Colonel, 6 months ago you had 50 hours in the B-52. Today, you successfully landed a crippled aircraft with no hydraulic assist and saved 8 lives. What do you think? I think I had help from a very experienced pilot. You had advice from someone who'd been there before, but you were the one flying the airplane. You made the decisions and executed a perfect landing under impossible conditions. Mitchell leaned back. Parker, there are colonels with 2,000 hours who couldn't have done what you did today. What about my crew? Chen spotted problems he'd never seen before and responded perfectly. Rodriguez handled communications like a veteran. The entire crew worked seamlessly. Parker nodded slowly. So what happens now? Now, you go back to Barksdale and continue training. In a few weeks, you'll get orders for additional specialized training. After that, you'll go places and do things you can't talk about for 30 years. And you, ma'am? Mitchell smiled. I go back to being a retired test pilot who occasionally consults on training issues. Ma'am, why did you really retire? Someone with your qualifications could have made general. Mitchell was quiet for a moment. Colonel, I spent 12 years flying combat missions. 5 years testing experimental modifications, and 5 more training young pilots. After 22 years, I'd given enough. It was time to let someone else carry the load. But you're still here, still helping. Some commitments don't end with retirement papers. The mission continues. Mitchell stood and extended her hand. It's been an honor flying with you today, Colonel Parker. Take care of your crew. They're going to do great things. 6 weeks later, Colonel Parker and his crew were back at Barksdale Air Force Base, but everything had changed. They'd received orders for specialized tactical training, which turned out to be the most intense flying program any of them had ever experienced. Jesus, Parker, what did you guys do on that training flight? Asked Major Steve Collins, another B-52 pilot who'd watched Parker's crew get selected for the mystery program. We had an emergency landing at Altus, Parker replied, not wanting to get into details. But it had been exciting enough to change their lives. The crew that had struggled through routine training was now being groomed for missions that didn't officially exist. Long-range penetration flights, electronic warfare scenarios, and tactical situations that pushed both aircraft and crew to their limits. Technical Sergeant Chen was loving the advanced systems training. "You know," he said to Rodriguez after a challenging simulator session, "that woman on our flight knew all this stuff. She was teaching us things they're just now showing us in classified briefings." "I keep thinking about that," Rodriguez replied. "She said she helped write the emergency procedures manual, but the last major revision was classified way above normal test pilot work." They'd all been thinking about Sarah Mitchell, the mysterious civilian contractor who'd appeared to save their lives. Parker had tried to find more information, but her personnel file was mostly redacted. What little he could access confirmed she'd been a test pilot and weapons school instructor, but there were gaps, suggesting involvement in programs that didn't appear in official documentation. "I heard from a guy at Edwards," Chen said quietly, "that she wasn't just testing aircraft modifications. She was testing tactics and procedures for missions that are still classified." Rodriguez nodded. That would explain how she knew so much about emergency procedures. If you're developing tactics for high-threat environments, you need to know every way the aircraft can break. Meanwhile, at a small office in a nondescript building outside Washington, D.C., Sarah Mitchell was reading reports about Parker's crew's progress. She'd written the recommendation that got them selected, and now she was monitoring their development. "How are they doing?" asked Colonel Jim Morrison, her current boss in an organization that didn't officially exist. "Better than expected," Mitchell replied. "Parker has turned into an exceptional pilot. His crew is functioning at a level that normally takes years to develop." "And you think they're ready for operational assignments?" "I think they're ready for the next phase of training. The emergency response showed they can function under extreme pressure. Now we need to see how they handle tactical scenarios." Morrison nodded. "What about Mitchell? Any concerns about her identifying you?" "None. As far as they know, I'm a retired test pilot who occasionally consults for the Air Force." "Good, because we're going to need more crews like this one." Mitchell looked out the window at the Washington skyline. "There are plenty of good pilots out there, Jim. They just need the right kind of training. The kind that involves real emergencies. The kind that shows them what they're really capable of when everything goes wrong." 3 months later, Parker's crew was deep into their specialized training when they encountered Sarah Mitchell again. This time, she wasn't disguised as a civilian contractor. Parker was walking out of a classified briefing at a facility he couldn't name when he saw her in the hallway wearing an Air Force uniform with no name tag or rank insignia. "Colonel Mitchell?" he said, stopping in surprise. She turned and smiled. "Hello, Colonel Parker. How's the training going?" "Good, ma'am. Very challenging." He looked at her uniform, noting the absence of identifying marks. "Ma'am, I thought you were retired." "I am retired. From the regular Air Force." She gestured down the hallway. "Walk with me." They moved toward a secure conference room, passing other personnel who also wore unmarked uniforms. Parker was beginning to understand that he'd entered a world where normal military protocols didn't apply. "Colonel," Mitchell said as they reached a secure area, "what I'm about to tell you is classified at a level that requires you to sign additional security agreements. Are you willing to do that?" Parker nodded. "Yes, ma'am." 10 minutes later, after signing documents he couldn't discuss with anyone, Parker learned the truth about Sarah Mitchell and the organization she really worked for. "We're part of a special operations unit that doesn't appear in any official Air Force structure," she explained. "Our mission is to develop and test tactics for scenarios that the regular Air Force hopes never happen." "What kind of scenarios?" "Deep penetration missions into heavily defended airspace, electronic warfare operations against near-peer adversaries, strategic reconnaissance flights that require absolute deniability." Parker felt pieces clicking into place. "And my crew?" "Your crew has been selected for this program based on their performance during the emergency. We need pilots who can think clearly and function effectively when everything goes wrong." "Is that why you were on our training flight? To evaluate us?" Partly, but the emergency was real, Colonel. I was as surprised as anyone when Captain Williams had his heart attack. Mitchell stood and walked to a wall covered with photographs of aircraft and crews. What wasn't surprising was how well your crew handled the crisis. That told us everything we needed to know about your potential. What happens now? Now you and your crew undergo 6 months of the most intensive training the Air Force has to offer. You'll learn things about the B-52 that aren't in any manual. You'll fly missions that officially never happen. Parker looked at the photographs on the wall, recognizing some of the aircraft, but not others. And if we complete the training, then you become part of something that most Air Force personnel don't know exists. Your squadron will be told you've been reassigned to a classified test program. Your families will know you're involved in important work, but not the details. Mitchell turned back to face him. Colonel, this is not a decision to take lightly. Once you're read into this program, there's no going back to regular Air Force operations. Parker thought about his crew, Chen, Rodriguez, and the others who'd performed so well during the emergency. Ma'am, we're in. I hoped you'd say that. Mitchell smiled. Welcome to the Invisible Air Force, Colonel Parker. 1 year later, Colonel Parker stood in the cockpit of a B-52 that looked similar to the aircraft he'd learned to fly, but was equipped with systems that didn't officially exist. His crew had completed their specialized training and were now part of an elite unit that operated in the shadows of the regular Air Force. Eagle 6-4, you are cleared for departure, came the voice over the radio. But this wasn't a normal air traffic controller. This was a mission commander who coordinated operations that appeared on no public flight schedules. Eagle 6-4, rolling, Parker replied as he advanced the throttles on the modified B-52. Technical Sergeant Chen, now wearing the stripes of a master sergeant, monitored systems that weren't found in standard aircraft. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, promoted to Technical Sergeant, managed communications equipment that could operate on frequencies most militaries didn't know existed. Captain Williams had recovered fully from his heart attack and was now flying a desk at Air Force headquarters, never knowing that his medical emergency had launched his former crew into the most classified flying program in the Air Force. Systems nominal, Chen reported as they climbed through 10,000 feet. All modifications operating within parameters. Roger that, Parker replied. After a year of intensive training, his crew functioned with the precision of a Swiss watch. They'd flown missions he couldn't discuss to places that didn't appear on maps, carrying equipment that officially didn't exist. Colonel, Rodriguez said over the intercom, we're passing through flight level 300, on course for the location. Even among themselves, they'd learned to speak carefully. Their missions were so classified that they used code words for everything, including their destinations. As they leveled off at their cruising altitude, Parker thought about the emergency that had changed their lives. If Captain Williams hadn't collapsed, if Sarah Mitchell hadn't been on board, if they hadn't handled the crisis with such skill, none of this would have happened. You know, Chen said over the intercom, I still think about that day at Altus. How Colonel Mitchell knew exactly what to do. She saved our lives, Rodriguez replied. But more than that, she opened a door we didn't even know existed. Parker smiled as he trimmed the aircraft for cruise flight.
She did more than that. She showed us what we were capable of.
Through his headset, Parker heard a familiar voice on a discrete frequency. Sarah Mitchell, now serving as mission commander for their operation.
Eagle 6-4, this is oversight. Mission parameters are confirmed. Execute as briefed.
Oversight, Eagle 6-4 copies. Beginning mission profile.
Parker banked the aircraft toward coordinates that would never appear in any flight log, carrying equipment that would never be acknowledged, on a mission that would never be discussed. But as they flew into the darkness, he knew that somewhere below, people were sleeping safely in their beds, protected by operations they would never know about, conducted by airmen whose names would never be in history books.
Colonel,
Chen said quietly,
you ever miss the regular Air Force?
Parker looked out at the star-filled sky and thought about the question. They were part of something now that few people would ever understand. Guardians operating in the shadows, protecting a world that didn't know they existed.
No,
He said finally.
I don't miss it at all.
The B-52 disappeared into the night, carrying its crew toward another mission that officially never happened, flown by airmen who officially didn't exist. And somewhere in a secure facility, Sarah Mitchell watched their progress on screens that showed the invisible war being fought every day by people like Colonel Parker and his crew, the quiet professionals who kept the world safe while remaining forever in the shadows.
Good hunting, Eagle 6-4.
She whispered into her headset. The aircraft's transponder went dark as they crossed into airspace that didn't appear on any civilian charts, and the legend of the mysterious woman in the cockpit became just another story that would never be told.